what is a win condition? By definition, it is a strategy that allows you to achieve victory. This definition is flawed because by that logic, if you are going against a full swarm deck, then Mother Witch is a win condition, which she would be for the duration of that match, but realistically, you won't face trash like this in a real game. So in Clash Royale, a win condition is a card that can consistently deal damage to towers in majority of the matchups, or force out specific mistakes that leads to you exploiting it for damage. Still, by this definition, we can consider Evolved Bomber a win condition, and I think it actually was before the nerf, but for simplicity, I will be using the ones that Royale API displays, since personally I think it's the most accurate and consistent list, minus the Sparky because I have no clue why it's here. Starting off with the heaviest win condition, and it's Golem. His playstyle is the pinnacle of what beatdown archetype stands for, as your main focus is building one massive push to take out the whole game with it. For 8 elixir you get a tank, beefy enough that it has more HP than King Tower, but that expensive cost means you can't support him if you play him on the bridge. 99% of the time, your Golem is supposed to be played behind the King Tower to set up for that one push that would win you the game. Being this heavy means the average push will last too long that by the time your opponent defends the push, you would already have cycled to another Golem and are ready to start another push. Now when the Golem dies, he explodes into 2 smaller entities that have a decent amount of HP, but the problem is, while exploding, the tower will retarget onto one of your supporting troops instead of the Golemites. This makes Night Witch the perfect support for Golem because with the bats she spawns, the tower will take out one of them and go back to attacking the Golemites, keeping your push safe. Electro Dragon can do the same thing, as with every hit he lands, he stuns his target, causing them to retarget away from your push into the Golemites. And with E-Drag being a part of your deck, Tornado will provide you massive value in grouping things together, and the death damage on the Golem is just a nice extra bonus. Sometimes you can pull Inferno Dragons or Sparkies closer to your E-Drag to shut them down completely, or you can line up troops closer to the tower to get some sneaky tower connections against difficult matchups. One final note, being a beatdown deck means you should not be afraid to take tower damage to save elixir for your big push. Well, maybe that is taking it a bit too far. That's average Golem gameplay for you. Next we got the Goblin Giant. He's quite low on HP when you consider the fact that he costs 6 elixir. However, he makes up for it by having a relatively quicker movement speed than the rest of the giants. His HP count makes him very easy to defend, so you should be playing him on the bridge to catch your opponents off guard instead of playing him in the back. The speed goblins on his back are also part of the reason he's better off played at the bridge, because they assist him in taking out some of the defensive cards. They are also responsible for most of the DPS on enemy towers, as the Goblin Giant himself deals low amount of damage with his attacks. The immediate response required to tank the spear goblins makes Sparky a great support for him, as they will be forced to choose who to deal with first, and the spear goblins can team up with the Sparky to finish off some of the things that she ends up shooting, so she doesn't have to waste a second shot on them. For spells, Rage is the main go-to option because with the spear goblins on his back, it can take out plenty of cards pretty quick, and the speed effect does make him attack faster while also making the spear goblin attack faster, so it's a 2-in-1 package. And coincidentally, the Rage seems to work extremely well with Sparky, so it's a 3-in-1 package now. Next we got the Giant. For 5 elixir you get the most basic tank in the game, and the way I would describe him is jack of all trades, master of none. He's a mix of Golem and Goblin Giant, as you can both play him in the back to make a big push or play him on the bridge for that sudden pressure you aim to apply on your opponent. And the way you play him or the spell you use with him varies depending on what deck variation you are running with him. Like for example, if you're running a normal Giant beatdown deck, then you need Zap to stun Inferno Dragons, Inferno Towers, and Sparkies. But if you're running Giant Graveyard, then you should play Snowball instead of Zap, because Inferno Towers typically don't matter as much in a graveyard push. Arrows can come with it, as it takes out bigger threats like minions and goblins, but also Arrows and Snowball as a combo can take out a Mother Witch, which is the bane of the graveyard's existence. Notice how the card selection is centered around Graveyard, not the Giant, so typically you want to run swarm cards like Skeleton Army and Bats to bait out spells for your graveyard. And then there is that mini P.E.K.K.A, so you aren't put in a position like this.
What is this?
To cut it short, Giant is just an extremely versatile card that just works with many different playstyles. Next we got the Lava Hound. Think of her as a lighter golem that costs 7 elixir and flies, except instead of golemites, she splits into 6 lava pups. Lava Hound usually depends on exploiting the fact that other decks don't have 5 million air counters, which makes their push nearly impossible to stop in some situations. To further amplify this weakness, they run spells designed specifically to counter the common air counters, like arrows for example. However, you can also be exploited for your lack of ground units, which means you need to generally be careful about that. A common move you will see people go for is tower trading against you, which is fine, but racing to 3 crowns is generally a bad idea as your balloon's lack of range will mess up your push structure, making it less threatening. Next we got the balloon. For 5 elixir you get what is basically a flying hog rider, but with a slower moving speed. Much like the Lava Hound, balloon decks also depend on the lack of air counters on your opponent's side. However, having mostly just the balloon as a flying tower threat means it's quite a bit easier for your opponent to manage defending with their few air counters. But that also means you wouldn't have the lack of ground answers as a weakness unlike Lava Hound decks. Balloon decks either come in a heavy format which utilizes spells like freeze to get those balloon connections, where you typically go all in with the expensive spell in sudden death so that the elixir overcommitment doesn't bite you back since you won the game with it. Or they come in light cycle format where they mostly focus on playing as much balloons as possible to keep outcycling enemy air counters. Even if they don't get any balloon connections, usually they are fine stacking up death damage and winning through overtime. Next we got the Electro Giant. For 7 elixir, you get a tank that has less HP than the 5 elixir giant, but was compensated with its ability to somewhat defend itself. The ring around him zaps every living and non-living thing that deals damage to him as long as they are inside of it, making Swarm unusable against it. Since it got that built-in support, it usually doesn't need supporting units with it and can be placed on its own at the bridge and just do fine. Most of the time, the best support with him is a tornado spell, as it can nullify Inferno Dragon or kill every single ranged troop by pulling them into the zap zone. Since buildings can't be pulled and are often placed away from his zap zone, they are an effective counter against him, which is exactly why majority of E-Giant decks either run Earthquake or Lightning as a method to get rid of buildings. Next we got the Elixir Golem. For only 3 elixir you get an Elixir Golem that splits into 2 smaller golemites that also split into 2 smaller blobs each. What makes him special is that his total HP is higher than the giant while being nearly half his price, so you got a cheap beefy boy on your hand here. The catch is, every time your opponent pops one of the forms, they gain some elixir, so using him recklessly is quite dangerous. Being a cheaper tank means it's possible for you to throw a counter push at any moment with your surviving defensive troops, instead of being locked into only playing him in the back like Golem and Lava Hound. Battle Healer seems to be the troop that's always present in every single Elixir Golem deck, because her healing him would delay the elixir your opponent gets from killing the blobs, which is quite annoying. An important strategy that you can abuse is actually spamming the Elixir Golem on double and triple elixir, because with how fast the elixir bar fills by default, there is a high chance your opponent will leak some of the death elixir, so that gives you the upsides of the Elixir Golem without the downsides. There is a reason why Bro is broken in 7x elixir. Next we got the Graveyard. For 5 elixir you get a spell that will consistently spawn skeletons anywhere you want on the arena, making it a reliable source of damage. The worst nightmare of every Graveyard player is an activated King Tower, because with it activated, it's near impossible to get any damage with your Graveyard. You might as well quit the match, which is exactly why Graveyard decks don't use cards like Firecracker and Evolve Bomber, as they usually are just free King Tower activation if your opponent didn't have a single digit IQ. And for the same reason, they prioritize defense over offense, as a 2-tower situation is always worse for them compared to any other opponent. Most of Graveyard pushes come from counter pushing with the remaining troops after a successful defense, because overcommitting on offense can push your opponent to go for a tower trade situation, and that is never a situation you want to find yourself as a Graveyard player. Unless you play Giant Graveyard, then typically you aren't too hurt from the King Tower, and being in a 2-tower situation is not that bad. Next we got the Miner. For 3 elixir you get a mini tank you can place anywhere in the arena including your opponent's side, making him the most versatile win condition in the game. Most of the time he goes as a secondary win condition in a wide variety of decks. In beatdown decks he acts as an assassin that would be used to get rid of some annoying support troops to help with your main push, or as a way to sneak in tower damage if your win condition just can't find a way to break through the opponent's defense. And in cycle decks, he acts as a pressure tool that would assist your primary win condition in reaching the enemy tower safely. If used as a main win condition, he almost always comes with poison. In fact, people literally refer to miner decks by the name Miner Poison. The playstyle here is mostly preventing any damage on your tower regardless of how tiny it is, because chances are you will win by damage done in overtime instead of actually by taking a tower. Besides defending, you want to be consistently pressuring the opponent to make sure he doesn't get a single push going on no matter what. Poison here serves as a key tool allowing you to gain tower damage while also killing cards that would be necessary for your opponent's push. And sometimes when the enemy doesn't have a mini tank, you can pair the poison with the miner, which makes stopping him with swarm or glass cannons near impossible. Next we got the wall breakers. For 2 elixir you get 2 tiny explosive skeletons that run directly to buildings, dealing rocket-like damage if connected. Upon connection, the explosion can also damage your opponent's troop or even take them out, so sometimes you might not even have to worry about a counter push. The catch is, they are so easy to stop that any small spell with the help of the tower will completely shut them down, making them low-key unreliable on their own. To combat this issue, most decks run a miner with them and tend to send him first to tank the tower shots to make them more annoying to stop. And as a plus, the miner can be your main source of damage in case your opponent has some building, because when they do, having your wall breakers connect to the tower is near impossible. Aside the miner, you usually should also run a mini tank like Ice Golem or Valkyrie, which can be used as an alternative way to tank for them in case your miner was out of cycle or was just not doing it for you. Next we got the Goblin Barrel. For 3 elixir you get a barrel that spawns 3 goblins anywhere you want on the arena in a triangle formation. Throwing the barrel directly on a structure will cause the goblins to get pushed away from one another, which makes them harder to flawlessly counter with troops. And by playing them on different tiles, you can switch up their formation depending on what troops your opponent uses to counter them. This means that spells are the best counter, as they would counter them regardless of the tile they were played on. Obviously, if tanked for, spells like Zap and Snowball wouldn't take them out. That's why they are always paired with annoying troops that are weak to log or arrows like the Princess, Dart Goblin and the Rascals. Being weak to spells means if your opponent doesn't miss a spell, you won't get any damage on their tower. This is why you have to juke them and try to play tricky barrels and be on top of the mind games. Most Goblin Barrel decks have 2 or more sources of consistent tower damage just in case you go against someone with 2 or 3 small spells. Trust me, they exist. I was one of them at some point. Princess specifically is a must use with Goblin Barrel because it helps get damage on towers by playing her directly on the bridge. Or it annoys your opponent because she is extremely hard to take out without a spell, which if they do use one on her, you can just Goblin Barrel immediately. Spells can also be used for that matter, with Rocket being the most common one, as bait decks don't have the quickest cycle, so they need that strong tower finisher in hand. And if you feel adventurous, you can use a second light win condition like Wall Breakers and Skeleton Barrels, as they are also decent at baiting out spells, so they synergize well with your Goblin Barrel. Next we got the Skeleton Barrel. For 3 elixir you get Flying Barrel that goes directly for buildings and drops some skeletons when it reaches one, or when you pop the balloons of the barrel, not the children's balloons, you psycho. What is wrong with you? The fact skeletons die to every single small spell means it's not only viable in lock bait, but also it can work in some zap bait decks that has things like Sparky or Inferno Dragon. When the Skeleton Barrel pops, there is a somewhat lengthy animation before the skeletons spawn. This animation, while looks like a bad thing, is actually quite helpful, especially if your opponent is dumb enough to mess up the timing of their spell. It can also be exploited by having it pair with Clone, as you can't use a spell on both barrels due to the delay between them. Also, when it drops, it deals some tiny death damage which can take out speed goblins and skeletons or bats. And if paired with a small spell like Zap, the death damage can take out minions or dagger goblins. The death damage is part of what makes it a reliable source of tower damage, making it qualify as a win condition. Next we got the Goblin Drill. For 4 elixir you get a Goblin Barrel, but it's a building and can spawn more than 3 goblins if left unanswered. Unlike the Goblin Barrel though, The drill doesn't aim at baiting out spells like the log because it spawns goblins slowly one by one, but instead it mainly baits out mini tanks like the Valkyrie or the Dark Prince, which allows you to snipe the tower with Magic Archer or Evo Bomber by using the mini tank they just defended with. What I like about drill is versatility, as you can tank for it like you do for a Goblin Barrel, but if you want, you can also use it as a miner to tank for some other cards in your deck, and if that wasn't enough for you, it literally can be used as a defensive building if necessary, which can save your life in many occasions. Next we got the Royale Giant. For 6 Elixir you get a ranged tank that specifically targets buildings, making him a reliable source of damage. The Royale Giant is mostly a siege-like card as it can damage towers from nearly your own side. Being ranged means the Royale Giant decks can freely use Electro Spirit or Firecracker as they don't care about King Tower activations since he won't get in range of it.
Are you sure about that?
The main playstyle of the Royale Giant is closer to cycle than beatdown, but generally it's a hybrid of both, meaning you are supposed to focus on outcycling the enemy counters as your Royale Giant is guaranteed to get some damage on the tower with the right counter outside of your opponent's hand. And against pure cycle decks, given how you would struggle to outcycle them being a bit heavier yourself, you usually are supposed to go Royale Giant in the back and have a second one on the opposite side. Fisherman is one key card I see in every single Royale Giant deck as it can eliminate a decent amount of Royale Giant counters by pulling them away and into your tower. Next we got the Mortar. For 4 Elixir you get a siege building with enough range to snipe enemy towers from your own side by throwing a splashing rock on it. Most decks will have 1 or 2 tanks that they will use against you to distract your Mortar away from their tower. This means outcycling is a great game to play as a Mortar player, since if you get your Mortar to lock on a single second, you can focus on defending it as it will keep damaging the tower as long as it's alive, regardless of what the opponent plays. Besides playing an offensive role, being a cheap building means it can also play a major defensive role, as it can act as a way to kite tanks to help you shut down massive beatdown pushes, as they can be quite tough to stop without a building. So you may see Mortar in graveyard or bait decks acting as a double agent by alternating between offense and defense based on what you need to do in this moment. Notice how the Mortar's range is quite different from other cards, and that's because of the blind spot. Anything that is close to the Mortar would be out of its range, meaning it can just sit there doing nothing while a barbarian is attacking it. Despite it seeming like a negative trait, it's actually really good as it allows you to get locks on tower more frequently, and it also amplifies defensive capabilities as you can both defend and attack their towers at the same time by playing a high defensive Mortar, or even defending normally. The blind spot can help it retarget away from the giant into the ranged troop, which typically are the ones you should be taking out first. Often you even see Tornado and Mortar decks to abuse that blind spot mechanic by pulling things into it. Next we got the Xbow. For 6 Elixir you get a siege building that will snipe towers from your side by shooting a ton of arrows rapidly on it. This plays extremely similar to the Mortar in a sense where you wanna outcycle the tanks to get a lock on tower, yet so differently at the same time because how the Xbow deals way more damage in a much shorter time. This means Xbow players are satisfied with getting one lock on the tower, which then they will proceed to throw every single troop, building and loved one they have to protect their Xbow as soon as it locks on. Once you get a lock, usually it means you have enough damage to go defense mode for the rest of the match and never have to attack a single time again. And while defending, you just slowly spell cycle the tower with a fireball or a rocket to finish off the game. The reason you don't go for poison despite it damaging the tower more than fireball is because fireball has the ability to take out troops immediately, so it helps your Xbow lock on the tower. Usually every Xbow deck has Tesla with it, so it's safe to say they go together really well, just like me and Depression do. The reasons are because Xbow being 6 Elixir kind of makes it less accessible as a defensive building, so it needs that Tesla to fill that weakness for it. Furthermore, the fact Tesla goes underground helps it be a great offensive building to pair with Xbow, as it gives less spell value despite it being placed right next to it. Next we got the Hog Rider. For 4 Elixir you get a quick mini tank that goes for buildings and deals a ton of damage for some reason. See, the Hog is too quick that without the perfect counter in hand and near perfect reaction time, he will always guarantee at least one hit on the enemy tower. This means he should never be played in the back, but rather always be played on the bridge, as it gives your enemy less time to react to it making it more likely to connect. Usually you should be running a mini tank like an Ice Golem or a Mighty Miner that would help your Hog survive a tiny bit longer against a building. Besides that, things like Firecracker or Princess can also be necessary in some decks, so you can slowly chip down the tower in some terrible matchups. Next we got the Ram Rider. For 5 Elixir you get a ram that charges to towers, while the rider throws snares on troops that slows their movement speed by a ton. On surface level, she's quite similar to the Hog Rider, but mechanically, being slow without the charge makes her easy to stop with many more troops without getting any damage on towers. For this exact reason, she is unplayable in cycle decks, but instead finds a place in heavier P.E.K.K.A. or Mega Knight bridge spam decks. Despite being a bridge spam troop, she actually benefits a lot from being played in the back, so you can just play a P.E.K.K.A. right in front of her. Besides, if you play her on the bridge, for the first few seconds on the enemy side, she wouldn't be charging, so she would take a little bit longer to get to the tower. One of the most common cards seen with her is Snowball because, well, just look at the footage and you will know exactly why it's nearly a must use. Besides heavy decks, she can also be seen in lighter bridge spam decks, typically with the Lumberjack being the main tank, as the rage can be great with the snare mechanic. Next we got the Battle Ram. For 4 Elixir you get 2 Barbarians carrying a massive wooden ram that charges towards building and breaks on impact. You can use it like the Hog Rider on the bridge since it's cheap and nearly guarantees a connection with the right counters out of hand. And when it connects, not only does it deal a ton of damage, but also one of the Barbarians spawn right on the tower, so he is more likely to rack up even more damage. But just like the Ram Rider, with the right counters it gets stopped easily as it's significantly more vulnerable to stuns and knockbacks. So based on what the opponent has in hand, you can alternate between playing it in the back and playing a P.E.K.K.A. right in front of it, or spamming it on the bridge with a Bandit or a Royal Ghost while having another push on the opposite lane. And since it doesn't jump over the river, it can be used defensively as it can kite stuff to the opposite lane. Next we got the Royal Hogs. For 5 Elixir you get 4 mini Hog Riders that are lighter on HP and damage but can be overwhelming to non-splash units. It's quite impossible to stop them without splash, so you are guaranteed to get a bunch of damage even without something tanking for them. The issue is they are weak to splash, so even if you tank for them, it barely even changes a thing, as the splash attacks would get them either way. But against splashers, you have the ability to split them in a 2x2 formation, attacking both towers at once. Or you can just play them in a cycle deck, as that is effective to outcycle the enemy splashers or buildings. And since they are weak to Fireball, they also tend to use annoying Fireball bait cards like Flying Machine or Mother Witch, as they would have to pick who to Fireball. Their nature of splitting encouraged them to be played in heavier double lane pressure decks with things like Royal Recruits and Zappies. Like a beatdown deck, typically you start with Recruits or Zappies in the back, and then according to what side your opponent decided to defend, you can just bamboozle them and go with Hogs on the opposite side, or just split them in the middle. I mean, generally it's very tough to defend both sides at the same time, especially when they have to worry about a combination of ranged and melee troops. Finally, we have the 3 Musketeers. For 9 Elixir you get 3 Musketeers for a little more than the price of 2. Talk about the deal of the century. I'm joking, they're kinda garbage right now. Because the Musketeers are very weak to spells, playing them in the same lane is just asking to lose unless your opponent is dumb and doesn't have a spell. Majority of the time, you want to split them in the back and build a double lane push with them, kinda like the Royal Hogs. The issue is, even 2 Musketeers are usually great spell value for your opponent, so you need to bait their spell out with something else. Instead of playing Mother Witch or Flying Machine to bait out the Fireball, it's usually best to play the Elixir Collector, as it also synergizes with their high cost. Aside from being used with the Recruits as a double lane push, a lot of decks play them with some form of bridge spam cards where they would just spam the bridge right before the Musketeers cross it. The key here isn't to chip towers like Royal Hog pushes, but to overwhelm your opponent and possibly take out both towers. I low-key don't like advertising stuff, but check out channel memberships. I've literally only had Spoop as a member for the past 2 years, my dudes.